Today's passage is from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. Revelation 21, 1 through 8. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. God is with men, and he will live, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these are the words are trustworthy and true." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To him who is thirsty I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderous, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and the liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." Let me begin today with another edition of Brian's Bad Jokes. Here we go. A man died, and he went up to heaven, and St. Peter met him at the pearly gates. And Peter walked him through the gates and down the golden streets. And as he walked down the streets, the man looked from side to side, and he saw these amazing mansions. Some of the homes there were bordering on palaces with huge swimming pools and immaculate lawns, and occasionally the man would get a glimpse through a window inside. Hi, James.
Sorry. Can't have the babysitters.
The man would get a glimpse of these homes of just fabulous decor. And then St. Peter said, "Well, here's your home." And the man looked, and it was a rundown shack. Just 4 cement walls, a roof, and a door. And the man looked at St. Peter and said, "How can we pass all these amazing mansions, and this is all I get?" St. Peter kind of shrugged and said, "Well, I did the best you could with the money you sent." I'm not going to talk about money today, but I am going to talk about heaven. I should start by mentioning that I'm going to take this passage sort of in reverse. John recorded what he saw and then what it meant, and I'm going to start with the meaning and apply it to what John saw. In today's passage, we are coming to the end of Revelation, which means we're coming to the end of the Bible and the end of history itself. The book of Genesis began with the words, "In the beginning." And now we're looking beyond the end. Chapter 20 was the end of this world. The final victory of God when heaven and earth fled from God's presence. Today's passage takes us beyond the end to when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. And this passage directly tells us that's what we're talking about. Jesus himself said, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Now, Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, and the Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So Jesus was saying, "I am the A and the Z, the beginning and the end." Of course, this is about more than just alphabets. Jesus was saying that he is in every way the first and the last, that everything that exists came from him, and everything, one way or another, will end with him. This is not a unique idea in Revelation. Over the book of Isaiah, God said, "I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God." God was here before anyone else, and no one will outlast him. So he has no competition. He is the start of all things, and he is the end of all things. So that's what this passage is about. Everything in today's passage comes from this idea that Jesus is the beginning and the end. So I want to start today by talking about Jesus as the Alpha, the beginning, and then I'll talk about him as the Omega, the end. First, Jesus is the Alpha. He is the beginning. He is the start of everything. I think that can be a difficult idea for us to get our minds around. I've mentioned before that I help lead the Good News Club over at Southwestern. I teach a lesson and do a review game for the first, second, and third graders. And I also have a time what we call counseling. That is, I'll take a few kids off to the side and give them a chance to ask questions. With the older kids, this is more about their commitment and their relationship to God. But with first and second graders, it's mostly just a chance for them to ask a question. The most common question I get, by far, is how did God make something? How did God make a rock? How did God make my little sister? How did God make an ostrich? And the answer to that question is always some form of, God said, let there be light, and there was light. The second most common question I get is, who is God's dad? I understand that question. I think we've all been there. At some point in our lives, we all had that question in our mind. Who is God's dad? Where did God come from? It is a staggering thought to imagine that God is the beginning. To think that there can be a true Alpha, a first cause, a beginning of all things. That God does not come from anywhere, but that God is and always has been. And that's hard for us to get our minds around, but as we come closer to understanding that truth, it has a profound effect on our lives. Another preacher by the name of John Piper put it this way: I can't urge you too often to meditate on the staggering truth that God is the absolute Alpha. Find some serene moment and let this truth take hold of you, that God is the first, the beginning. Before him there was nothing. There was no before him. Just think of it. For millions and billions and trillions of unending years, God existed and never had a beginning. He is the beginning. The fact that God is the beginning has a profound and practical effect on our lives. Our God is good. Our God is merciful. God is love. God did not choose to be this way. No one made God this way. He simply is this way. From before there was time, this is who God is. And throughout eternity, this is who God shall be. He can no more be unmerciful than he could simply stop being God. This is who he is by his nature. I think we all have those moments when we recognize the worst of us. The night creeps in and we look back and say, today, I have been the worst part of me. The sin has just seemed to overwhelm me. We have those times where we wonder if this is the time. I've fallen into that same stupid sin just one too many times and God finally gives up on me. You've had that thought in your heart. Remember this. God is merciful. God is loving and forgiving, and he cannot be anything else. He didn't become this way. He has from before any beginning been merciful. God can no more be unmerciful than we could say that 2 + 2 = 7 million, or that a triangle has 10 sides. For God to lack mercy is to go against his very nature of who he is. God is merciful and always shall be. So God is the Alpha. He is the beginning. He is also the Omega. He is the end. I think that's what this passage is really focused on. As I mentioned a moment ago, we are approaching the end of Revelation, the end of the Bible, and the record of the end of this universe, the end of this heavens and earth. And so the focus here is on God as the Omega. He is the end of all that is. In a darker sense, he is the end of the wicked and the cruel. He is the end of sin. As I was preparing this sermon, I thought that perhaps I would talk a little bit about the sinfulness and wickedness of this world, but I thought about it and I realized you don't really need to hear that, because you've already heard it. You hear it every day. We are surrounded by the wickedness of this world. You've heard the stories of children being kidnapped to be forced into armies as soldiers. You've heard of parents who care more about their drug addiction than their own children. You've heard of the wickedness of this world. You've heard that Nazism and slavery is a thing again. Remember that wasn't a thing? We had gotten rid of those, and now they're back in our country. You know already that wickedness is a reality of this world. You hear that 6 days a week. So today, what I want to say is, there is justice. Not vengeance, not spite. There is justice. The Alpha and the Omega, the one who made everything that is the one who will bring an end to the wickedness of this world. That's not all he brings an end to. This passage, as I said, is built on this idea that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. And the rest of the passage continues to deal with things that God will bring an end to. So for the rest of the sermon, I want to talk about 3 more things that God is going to end. First, God will end the thirst for him. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." I found that people often get a little confused about that verse. I've heard a lot of people say that this verse is a blessing for those who are righteous, a blessing for those who are good and godly people. That's not really what these words mean. I'm hungry. That means 2 things. First, it means that I want food. And second, it means that I don't have food. Once I eat, I'm no longer hungry. I cannot be hungry and filled at the same time. I can only be one or the other. This is a blessing for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That means they are not already righteous. We cannot hunger after righteousness and be righteous at the same time. This is a blessing for those who want to be better than they are. This is a blessing for those who desire righteousness even as they recognize that they are sinners. It's a blessing for those who want to know God even as they know that their sin separates them from God. And the blessing here is that that desire will be met. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Today's passage tells the fulfillment of that blessing. Jesus said that we will no longer thirst for God because he will meet that desire. He'll put an end to that thirst because God says that to those who come to him, he will give to drink from the spring of the water of life. He will fulfill that desire. We will no longer thirst for God because that thirst will be quenched. Right now, we desire to be better than we are. We desire to be the best versions of ourselves. We desire to be godly and holy people. The promise of God is that he will put an end to that desire by meeting it, by fulfilling that desire in us. Second, Jesus said that he will put an end to loneliness. I think we've all heard the cliche, you're born alone and you die alone. I'm not sure about that first part. I think at least one other person has to be present for a birth. But, of course, this saying isn't literal. It's a way of recognizing that loneliness is a part of the human experience. That we all feel alone. That you can be in the middle of a crowded room and still feel very much alone. And we might forget about that loneliness for a while, but from birth to death, that loneliness never completely leaves us. But it will. The promise of God is to put an end to that loneliness. God says that when he fulfills his purpose in this world, then he'll put an end to that loneliness. That God will be with his people. That we will be his people and he will be our God. He will make his dwelling with us. It is sin that creates that loneliness. It is sin that separates us from God and separates us from one another. God promises to put an end to that. He promises that he will be with us. So the loneliness will be brought to an end. Finally, Jesus lists a series of things that he says will end. There will be an end to pain. There will be an end to mourning. There will be an end to death. And what I find most interesting about that is when Jesus describes heaven, he mainly describes what will end. He doesn't really tell us what heaven will be like. He tells us what heaven will not be like. And I suppose that kind of makes sense. Think about it this way. Imagine that you met someone who had spent his entire life in a frozen tundra in northern Canada. Now imagine trying to explain to that person what a tropical beach is like. How do you describe warm sand to someone who's only known frozen snow? How do you describe a cool breeze on a hot day to someone who's only known an icy blast on an already cold day? Most likely we'd end up telling him what's not there. There's no snow, there's no ice, there's no cold. That's how Jesus described heaven to us. We're not told a lot about what will be in heaven, but we're told what will not be there. There will be no suffering, no pain, no death, no more tears. The Alpha and the Omega, the one who has made us from the beginning, will put an end to the suffering of this world. I got one last thought to close out today's sermon. Heaven matters. I know that sounds simple. We know that heaven will matter when this life ends, but it matters right now. The fact that the Alpha and the Omega shall make all things new matters to our lives today. I think sometimes people get the idea that if we spend too much time thinking about heaven, then we're going to miss out on life now. And I understand the logic there, but the simple truth is that's not right. C.S. Lewis put it this way. If you read history, you will find that Christians who did the most in the present world were just those who thought the most about the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think about the other world that they have become so ineffective in this one. Heaven matters. God has a plan to bring an end to the sin and suffering of this world. And when we recognize that, when we understand God's work, then it affects how we live here and now. When we recognize the work that God is doing that encourages us to holy living right now. So be glad. Rejoice. The Alpha and the Omega, the one who has made us, is the one who shall make all things new. And when we live in the light of that truth, it changes the way we live right now. In a moment, we're going to stand for our invitation hymn. And as we stand to sing, if you don't have that reality in your life, if you don't feel confident that one day you will stand with God in His presence and in His paradise, if you fear the loss of this world, your life doesn't have to be that way. There's a God who desires for you to know Him, the God who is faithful to forgive when we turn to Him. If you want to make that own commitment, if you want to know in confidence that God is with you and that He has an eternal plan for you, you have a chance today. I ask you'll stand with me for our invitation hymn, which is number 463, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And we'll sing all the verses.